Hi, everyone. So, for lessons RBTS assignment, focusing on one chapter for each student, I got assigned chapter number 14. The title of this chapter is The Road to the Future is Paved with Respect for the Past. This is for spring 2020, our last semester. We're about to graduate, yay! And then class is advanced ASL. So that was the first slide. The second slide includes the contents of my presentation, and I start off with history, and then I move on to deaf interpreters section I titled The Big Shift, which is from the book itself, and then Deaf Heart is the last one, which is also a title, like a section from the book. That one's really exciting. I can't wait to talk about it. So on slide 3 is the main category is history, and then underneath I have two subcategories. I have the first deaf interpreters, excuse me, the first interpreters, and then I have the job of interpreting, and this is all history, so like the beginning. On slide 4, the title is the first interpreters, and the first interpreters were most likely to be children of deaf adults or friends of adults, deaf adults, something along the lines of that. You would say if my mom was deaf and she needed to go to the doctor, I as her daughter would most likely go to interpret for her. Or if my dad is deaf in this scenario, maybe if he doesn't want me to go as a female, he would get my brother to go to interpret. Or if my friend Sarah was deaf and she needed to go to the bank or something, I would go interpret for her. So that's how a lot of the first interpreters were. That's how it was. You interpreted for family and friends, and you weren't paid per se. You didn't have a paycheck because it wasn't considered a career, because you were just helping mom and dad, or you were helping Sally or Susie or whoever. So the way that interpreters were paid, because it wasn't considered a career, was more of a barter system. So if mom said, hey, I need to go to the doctor, can you come interpret for me? My payment would be, hey, I can watch the kids for the next couple days for you, or I can fix dinner for you and your family. Something along the lines of that. Something along the lines of that nature. There was no cash flow, really. It wasn't considered a career, so there was no cash flow. It was just a favor for a friend or a favor for a family member. The next section is the job of interpreting, discussing that. Like I said, it wasn't considered a career, so you didn't make money. It was a favor. It was like a barter system. If you do this, I'll do this. That's how it worked in the beginning. There was no pay. It wasn't a career. Just stuff like that. So our next section, section 2, is deaf interpreters, and I have 3 subcategories for that. Trust, shared experiences, and benefits. This is all focused around a deaf interpreter. So the first one, trust. It's a proven fact, and it's talked about in the book, that when people share experiences, in this case, like deafness, the trust resonates on a much deeper level. You trust somebody who has experienced the same things as you. So the trust between a deaf interpreter and a deaf consumer is so much greater than a hearing interpreter and a deaf client, because they can relate on a different level than I could as a hearing person. So the next one is talking about shared experiences. There are going to be many things that I will never relate to as a hearing person as the same as a deaf interpreter would to a deaf client. They come from dealing with the misunderstanding of deafness and deaf people. They come seen as less than a human because they needed an interpreter to make it through the world as understood as by hearing people. So they have strengths and weaknesses that I will never understand because I'm hearing, and this builds trust because of their shared experiences. So the last one for deaf interpreters is the benefits. So deaf interpreters are more likely to be native signers, and therefore the connection will be much more profound than a hearing interpreter, because they can explain it in a way that maybe I couldn't and I wouldn't understand as a hearing person. Deaf interpreters are able to get on a different level and explain things in more ASL than a hearing interpreter could. Another benefit of a deaf interpreter is it allows comfort to the deaf consumer because they don't feel alone a lot of times they may feel alone because they're the only deaf person, and then there's hearing people everywhere. So that's a benefit. The next slide is, it's called the big shift, and we're going to talk about professional versus non-professional hearing interpreters and deaf interpreters. So professional versus non-professional. As we all know, in the start, it was family and friends doing favors for each other. So it wasn't considered a profession. There was no groups to organize that you did for family and friends. You worked for yourself, basically. But when it became noticed that the need for interpreters was there, hearing people decided to start getting stuff together. And this was great because it allowed for growth in the deaf community, but it also allowed the door to be open for mistrust, because before, oh, I'll just get my daughter to interpret, I'll get my friend Jessica to interpret, and now it's like, okay, we have an interpreter for you. His name is Jim. Well, the deaf person doesn't know Jim because they didn't grow up in the deaf community. So it shifted from it being a non-profession to becoming a profession. The second part of the big shift is hearing interpreters. We're going to discuss hearing interpreters. With the introduction and the need for interpreters increasing, more hearing people stepped up who had no connection with the deaf community. And it, like I said before, it allowed for growth, but the deaf people in the community didn't know these interpreters. So we had to kind of get past that, and we're still working on it because you need to be close to the community to allow for trust. But yeah, hearing people became interpreters because of the introduction of the need for them. Deaf interpreters. Many of the early interpreters were hearing, but they were still a part of the deaf community. But some were born into interpreting, like many interpreters were hearing, like I said, but in situations where they couldn't have a hearing interpreter, deaf people would help each other and interpret for each other, and where one was lacking, the other person picked it up, and vice versa. So deaf people supported each other and helped to facilitate communication between these two deaf people and the hearing world outside. So deaf interpreters were a big deal. I wouldn't say they were interpreters because they couldn't understand both sides of the communication because they couldn't hear, but they helped each other. It was a give and take. They, say my mom and dad were saying they're deaf in this scenario, they go to the bank together, and maybe my dad misses the first half of the sentence, but my mom catches it. So they're able to feed off each other to figure out what is happening in the communication. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is the deaf heart. I'm going to talk about what it is, because I'd never heard of it before, and the 9 to 5 attitude. So the deaf heart, and I'm going to read exactly because this is from the book, it says, it means that an interpreter is connected to the deaf community. And what that meant to me was, I'm going to bring in the next slide because they work hand in hand, but the last slide, 16, it works hand in hand. It's not having a 9 to 5 attitude. And by that I mean, it's not just, I'm finished. They would take their time to make sure that the deaf person understands and that the communication is true and it's facilitated correctly. So having a deaf heart means you care not only that information is being thrown out there and left to the interpretation of whoever's trying to receive the information, but you're making sure that people are understanding what's going on. And that's it. Thank y'all.